About the relationship between class and classism and escalating inequality in the U.S. and the world. So you ready for us to go?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, sorry. So, Chuck Collins.
Denise.
It's good to have a chance to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about the fact that our faith community, Unitarian Universalism, has adopted escalating inequality and what we're going to do about escalating inequality in this country and the world as part of our study action work over the next 3 years. And one of the questions that we get a lot of with UU class conversations, people will say, well, what's class got to do with it? You know, and wanted to talk to you because I think you know what class has got to do with it in terms of escalating inequality.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We've done a lot of work over the last few years on, showing people the picture of inequality. Here's how it's growing, and here's what the 1%'s happening. But I think the more I learn about it, the more I would think people have a story in their head. It's sort of a classist narrative that explains inequality. Many people say, it doesn't matter because, and the story has something like, well, the people who have a lot of wealth somehow, by virtue of their own hard work or effort, have created that wealth. It's the myth of deservedness. Yes. And the people who don't have it, for some reason, didn't apply themselves or didn't work hard. And so you can present all the data there is about inequality. You can talk about why it's bad for society, but in people's head is this justification of inequality, and it's fundamentally mistaken. It's all about how the rules of the economy have been changed to benefit asset holders at the expense of everyone else. So I think that's why it's important to dig in and help, and people sort of begin to unpack class and classist assumptions and how that justifies policies that worsen inequality or keeps us paralyzed.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think it's interesting when we've done some of these workshops and we talk to folks about the role that class plays in escalating inequality, and people always seem to be surprised and they'll say, well, you start dealing with the stereotypes though, and it's true. I mean, we think about it and we'll say, but this person so deserves it. Not thinking about, but I love the whole, one of our, I won't say the name, but one of our former presidential candidates who, talked about, well, if you don't have money for college, you ask your folks, right? You just ask your folks for that. And, and that more people didn't react to that. And think about, well, maybe it's not a level, not everybody can say, knock, 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 Mom, Dad, I need a little bit of money for college. So, just automatically there are folks who aren't going to be able to have the same kind of education, certainly not the same educational level, because they are in a different class. And again, we just make assumptions, I think, all the time about how easy it is. And if you simply pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or as some people say, not everybody's got boots, and not everybody's got straps, not everybody's got boots.
I mean, that is the confusion of privilege, is people don't always see all the advantages, both very visible and obvious, but a lot of invisible advantages. Like being in a family that has multi-generational stability, access to health care, access to land and property and wealth. Like, they don't understand. So I come from that background. We don't always see all the ways that that's kind of a wind at our back. So there's that confusion. Well, why can't everybody do what I do? Why can't everybody be like me and do what our family did? And as opposed to people have really different experiences. That's why I think, I got to go, I've been to some of the workshops that you all have done, and I think that begins to unpack that storyline as people understand. I think there's a little bit of a danger within the UU tradition. People think, oh, well, I see a lot of we're all in the same boat. We're all upper middle class or middle class, college educated. And what's cool is to see a lot more people who are long time, people from working class backgrounds who are part of the UU congregations, who are kind of speaking out and saying, no, that's not true. We don't all have the same, class upbringing and experience. We don't all have the same current economic circumstances. In my congregation in Boston, I remember 2008, the economic meltdown happened. And we had a conversation, mostly people talk about whatever their pastoral life, but they didn't really talk about their economic life. Like how many people didn't have health insurance? How many people didn't have any money to fall back on? How many people were living alone in rental housing and at risk of displacement? All of a sudden, the economic lives of our congregation revealed that we were a much more class diverse congregation than we thought.
Well, it was interesting. I was doing a workshop in the Southwest, and it was interesting to me how many people came up afterwards and said, we always think of class as just money, but a lot of people think of class as just being about money.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more than that. It's some of these other things, though, that lead you to how much money you will or won't make. And interesting how many people talked about they didn't want people to know that they hadn't finished college. Sort of one of these indicators of class. They didn't want people to know. They were hiding it. And the first time they admitted that the fact that they hadn't gone to college, let alone have graduate degrees, was in this workshop, and it really kind of blew me away that people felt like they needed to hide this information from, and you wonder, well, how, as a faith community, that wants to have deep spiritual growth, when you can't be honest about something that is pretty basic in your life, when you feel compelled to hide that, how are you going to grow as a community if you feel like you can't talk about, I don't want to talk about income, but I also don't want to talk about my education. I don't want people to know that I don't own my home, that I'm in a rental, and I don't let anybody know that, I just, because I'm ashamed of that. That seems unfortunate.
I think that there's a little bit of in the New England in particular, there are these old traditional congregations. You have families that have been, I grew up in a UU family, but I'm like second generation. But I run into people who are like 18th, whatever, 10th generation UU. They have, and many of us who have privileged backgrounds don't want to tell the true story about the privilege either.
That's true, yes.
We kind of want to pretend like, oh yeah, we've just had that camp in Maine for 5 generations, and we're just regular folks, right? This is sort of, and I think when privileged people begin to talk about the help that they got, the opportunities, the wind at their back, the family help buying a house, the role of inherited wealth, the role of, the benefits of having a college-educated parent when you want to go to college yourself, all these, telling true stories about advantage and being vulnerable, like, wow, I got this help. If people with privilege can reveal the true sources of help that they got, because everybody gets help, then it makes it less stigmatized to say, well, I didn't get help, or I got this kind of help. And that's what a good society does. We help one another, in a congregation that has mutual aid and support helps one another. And if we have to mask or be dishonest about those privileges, it keeps the taboo, keeps the silence.
I'm glad you said that, because I was talking about people who will feel less than, but it is interesting to me, the same way in these workshops, how few people want to identify as owning class. They're very embarrassed by it, and that surprises me in some ways as well. So I'm glad that you said.
Well, there's sort of shame kind of woven through the whole thing, In a way, I think as a UU denomination, we obviously have to face class and race issues and how they're confused and intermingled, but we've for decades sort of had witness around racial justice. Not that our work is by anywhere finished there, but class remains, I think, our tripwire. We just still, as a tradition, not everywhere in the country, but I think we have some work, huge amount of work to do around understanding class culture, how that shapes everything from our worship to what we talk about at coffee hour to how much of a mutual aid community we are. And I think that requires some vulnerability, and we have to push through that shame of telling our real stories, whether it's stories of advantage or stories of exclusion. It's not just up to the working class people to sort of help us change the culture. Those of us who come from privileged backgrounds have a really important role to demystify that.
Are there things what are some of the things that you think a congregation can do, a UU congregation or organization might think about as they try to put class on the front burner and stop pretending that, I think is true of the U.S. in general. We tend to think of ourselves as, we're flat. We have everybody's middle class.
Yeah. Stop pretending is a good start. I like that. But I think sort of, can we name the class culture? Just like you would do in any organization or any room. What are the norms here? How are they a function of class? Is this a welcoming community for working class or people who raise poor? In the same way we think about being welcoming to gay, lesbian, transgender communities, how do we welcome working class people in our communities? How do we lift up and learn from people who have different class cultures, and how can that shape our worshipness? There's an old Utah Phillips joke, which is, what's the UU civil rights anthem? And it's, we will not allow ourselves to be moved. It's sort of like, we're emotionally, as another friend of mine says, we're God's frozen people, right? That's a joke, and we shouldn't.
Yes, I haven't heard that one.
We shouldn't, be. That's not to add to the shame. It's just to be playful and to say, we can loosen up a little bit here.
Right.
And part of the way to do that is to be honest, and vulnerable about what's worked and not worked in the society.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good time.